The chat.
There it is.
Hey.
What's up, everybody?
Oh, we're actually, I was like, hey, looking to make sure the stream's working here, but it's working here. There, I'm looking at me now. Hello, everyone. What it do? If you've been with us since the top of the day, you might recognize my voice, Gabby Durden here, and I'm back to hang out with Free. It is our first time on camera, but you are covering round 3. You just went over all of the Chapter 2 spoilers.
Yes, those are very exciting.
How's that been for you, doing all that?
No, overall, this event has been everything I've dreamed about, like just being here in person in live events. Typically, for people that know me a little bit, I do mostly online. So just being in a room packed full of Lorcana Lumineers is just a very exciting moment. And also, I get to commentate for the first time with you, so that's really, really exciting.
See, I'm excited too. My first time commentating with you. We gon' get into our round number 4. So I think an important stake setter for this round is this is where we're starting to hit that elimination territory, where if you're already down a few rounds, then you might just be dipping after this.
Yeah, so definitely the key target is X1. So basically consider this 8-round tournament as a double elimination tournament. You can lose once, but probably not twice if you want to make it to day 2 of competition. And that's going to play into the minds of these players. They need to make sure that fatigue doesn't start setting in. They need to make sure that because of their deck configurations, you know, the consistency is there, that they can get through all 8 rounds without dropping a single game due to, you know, maybe their own errors. And they want to make sure that they limit those and at the same time try to play through everything that their deck gives them and as well as everything that their opponents can do. And we're going to see if these two players can do that because it looks like we have a mirror match playing out here.
Yes, indeed. Some Amber Steel with Robert and Jack. I am curious as to what variations they have brought to the table because I don't know about you, but I feel like Amber Steel, and we were talking about this a bit in round number 2 when we saw an Amber Steel variant, does have very distinct paths that you can go down with that in combination.
Yeah, so a key note to what you're mentioning right now is the different type of shifting targets that you go into. Some people subscribe to maybe the Jack package with the 1-drop going into the 5-drop. Here, actually, we do get to see it's Amber Steel, and the color that the other player is playing is Sapphire. It's actually not a mirror match, as it turns out. So we do get to see different, especially 3 drops in this matchup. So on one side, we get to see the Singing Arrow, but on the other one, the Ramping Mickey. And this Mickey is one of my favorite cards in the game, so very excited to see this sort of. So what Robert is trying to do is actually gain control of the board while at the same time getting card advantage with his Amber cards. So we'll get to see if he can do that. And
indeed. I'm actually seeing if I can find Robert's deck here because I feel like when we see a combination that isn't as common, we might as well.
What tools they have available to them. And
here.
From what we see here, we do get to see the Hades, which is a card that people have been playing in much larger numbers than before. Hades, the 4-drop 3-2 that lets you buy back a card from the discard pile. A lot better in this floor of, you know, players that have so many control decks. And we do get to see you have Origami Inked and playing a Maleficent. So this Maleficent, also one of my favorite cards in the game, as it does have 3 questing power. 3 questing power, as we've seen before, one of the key metrics for cards in set 1. So
it does feel like in the early stages, people were still trying to figure out if they wanted to use these vanilla bodies, and then it became very clear that 3 lore points is such an important breaking point when it comes to actually questing and really putting pressure on your opponent.
And the point of this is basically saying, like, you only have to tap this card once in order to gain 3 lore, and even if it gets removed on the way back, you still got a massive amount of value, whereas something with only 1 questing or 2 questing power does not. So that's why those vanillas are so powerful. And let's see here, we do get to see the Ariel, a Prince Eric, resolved Hades, and then with the card I can see the last card, but overall, decent amount of control on the board from the side of Jack, and we're going to get to see if Robert gets to use, like we were mentioning before, this Maleficent to its full value, and when does he actually get to quest with it. And we see a 5-drop card here, and we see another Maleficent actually.
So doubling up and the let it go.
Yes, so instead of using it for the 3 questing power on this turn, what he's going to do is put it sideways, rely on its body being good enough to make it survive the turn cycle, and use let it go instead to sing away one of the threats from the other side. So Jack now has to choose how he wants to deal with this Maleficent body on the way back, and Mickey getting a little bit of value before ending the turn. So
Oh, what a nice way to use that big body of Maleficent. Because often when you are turning to a character to sing a song, just like you said, you make them vulnerable.
Yeah.
And in Ariel, for instance, while 3 is somewhat of a breaking point in the early game, later on you can still kind of either smash or bring something to take her away. Obviously, it doesn't matter if she's exerted for the smash, but you know what I mean. It's not the biggest threat of a body, but Maleficent with a bit more of that sticky power, especially with 2. And I'm curious your thoughts on Sapphire in general. Dan and I were talking about the lack of presence of this ink compared to others, and that it has excellent ramp, but maybe some difficulty identifying what those heavy hitters are, and people are experimenting rather, trying to figure out how it pairs best with other inks. What are your thoughts on the way that people can incorporate Sapphire?
Yeah, so the best answer to your question is, and it piggybacks off what you mentioned before with the 3 questing power and having a lot of vanillas in the Sapphire color. The reason why Sapphire is so underrepresented is because people are not exploring deeply enough into these 3 questing power vanillas, something like the 6-drop Mufasa that exists in this color combination as well, this Maleficent that's seen being prevalent in this tournament so far. It may not be the most exciting cards because they don't have a lot of text box when it comes to what they do, but they just have so much questing power that you win during the course of the mid game. So I think that there's a lot to be explored with just stat sticks with a lot of questing power, and I think that that's where those bombs, come into effect. And obviously, like we mentioned before with the ramping Mickey, just being able to go from your early game to your late game is very powerful. So I do want to see Sapphire be more prevalent in the format moving forward, but this is one way to do that with these Maleficents.
That means Robert has an inkwell of 5 right now, but Jack is still keeping pace, 7 in the inkwell available in totality. And, of course, again, that Amber Steel combination that we expect to see quite frequently. I can see why you do enjoy this Mickey Mouse card, because not only do you have the ramp, but it feels like you do have a decent trade-off in terms of not making it too strong, because you are taking a card out of your deck unaware of it. And whenever you have that contingency on a card that you must keep in mind when going into the rest of your deck, it feels more appropriate to have it at the level it is, right, with the cost and the effectiveness of it.
Yeah, exactly. So making Mickey a 1/3, it's a downside, but a fair downside when you look at the fact that the card replaces itself by taking a card from the top of the deck in order to ramp 1 and letting you play your more powerful cards earlier, and those giving you a lot more card advantage as well. So just a decently static card all around. Being uninkable is one of the main reasons it's not used in some other like ramp archetypes. When it comes to a mid-range deck like this one, it's quite powerful. So. Oh, and we do see Mr. Squee being a 2/5 on the table. Very powerful. Another stat stick that we were mentioning before. Not necessarily that much questing power, but again, just difficult to deal with removal spells. So I do like the inclusion of that card. Ooh, and we do see a turning point here with Beast getting rid of the eyeball that gives you more questing power. So pretty good in this matchup overall, getting rid of that extra questing power.
It does feel like we have seen a big uptick in Beast's Brought for anyone that has Steel within their deck. And Ruby Amethyst being one of the biggest targets of that because of the prevalence of items there. But here you saw Eye of the Fates can be so good at just really increasing that questing power of your units, and Jack's ability to deny that from Robert fairly early with one of the only ways of removing items is one way for Jack to try and offset the lore that Robert has already built up at this point.
And that's one of the consequences of playing Beast in the Steel color. It's one of the only options against those very powerful items in many matchups. So we can see here Eye of the Fates being a very early on inclusion, but even better now that we get to see this sort of turbo questing strategy coming through. So
the difficulty with turbo questing, though, is it does feel like you eventually hit a wall.
Yes, you might run out of card advantage, especially if you don't see something like a Surfing Stitch or a Rapunzel. We haven't seen either of those cards be effective right now, but we do see that from the side of Jack, actually, being able to utilize this Cerberus, having 3 damage on it to draw 3 cards, and Jack is certainly not hurting from the card advantage perspective, but can he actually deal with the fact that he's only at 5 against the 10 lore from the other side of the table? It does seem like he is gaining a lot more board advantage, but can he close out the game before, again, Robert is able to? So,
yeah, that's what I'm curious to look at Jack's deck as well. Having some difficulty finding it here, though. Gosh darn it!
I do want to see Robert sort of turn the corner with something like a 7-drop Hades, an incredibly powerful card that can deal with this beast while at the same time developing 2 more questing power. So that'd be one of the best plays for him. Otherwise, he can play another 3 questing power like another Maleficent or something of that nature. Or maybe another card into Surfing Stitch. We haven't seen him do that yet. So a lot of options that Robert could have. But right now, just Jack putting a lot of pressure on the table. And that's a consequence of no Be Prepared anywhere in this matchup. So he can go as wide as he wants without any sort of punish.
And those are great mentions. The Surfer Stitch as well as Hades, because when you have both Hades and Let It Go within your deck, that's a lot of utility. Let It Go being the song that Hades can basically do while also getting a body uninkable, of course, which is why that combo kind of works, because Let It Go, if you run into Hades, you can just ink Let It Go, or you can play it early.
This is a funny little mental image of Hades actually singing Let It Go.
Right?
But instead of ice it being flames, it's kind of quite thematic in that way.
I can't help but whenever there's pairings like that, Hades and Let It Go, think of the character doing the song. Yeah. Well, and they've set up such a great world for Lorcana because of Floodborn and kind of these different multiverse feelings. So I'm like, why not? Why can't Hades sing Let It Go?
It doesn't have to be stuck to the original notion of Hades being this like evil character. He can be a happy character with the Let It Go.
There's one Hades that is the ruler of Olympus and kind of a hero. So maybe that Hades is the one that actually sings Let It Go. The villain one is just trying to take away that power.
This villain one definitely, true to its name, a villain getting rid of one of Jack's options on the other side. We haven't seen it yet, but we do get to see Rapunzel without value. But again, Robert at this point just wants to make sure that he tries to end the game as soon as possible with every threat. Being at 10, I don't see that with the resources that he has in play right now. But again, he could top deck one of these very powerful Surfing Stitches or Hades to get him through the finish line. And on the other side, Jack is actually taking complete control of the board. And again, he's drawing 3 cards with this very powerful Rapunzel.
That board has just been getting wider and wider. You see that when Robert has to do things like play that Rapunzel without value, decides, let's just
and we do get to see a concession here. And this concession, like we were mentioning in round 3, conceding early on might look detrimental at first, but just giving yourself as much time to play out the match, play out game 2 and play out game 3. So Robert there just saw the writing on the wall and decided, okay, I'm going to give myself a better chance in the following game. And it's just a consequence of getting these players have a very good record moving into round 4. They understand how the matchup goes. They understand when the game is over, and very astute play from the side of Robert to just move on to game 2.
Yep, 1-0 currently on the scoreboard in this best of 3. And that is a very particular consideration for these kind of formats, because I don't know about you, but personally, when playing in the online vicinity, I'm very, never give up. I'm never going to concede because and then in card games, though, and then especially in-person card games, it does feel differently than any other genre of gaming on the competitive spectrum, because I know what my deck does. I know what your deck does. I know where those windows are and if that window is open or shut. And time is of the essence in these matchups. Not as much as you need it in a Ruby Amethyst Mirror match, but still very important.
Yeah, and it's a consequence of, like I said, in real-life events, only 50 minutes on the clock in order to be 35 minutes in this one, because it's only a best of 1. It's best of 2s, yeah.
Best of 3.
There we go. Win 2 games is what I meant to say. Limited amount of time in the end, and it just being a consequence of you need to understand where those windows lie and being able to say, okay, do I give myself the highest chance of winning by conceding this and moving forward, or is there actually enough of a chance for me to justify continuing the game? And like you mentioned, a lot of people who may not have that experience say, I'm going to stay in this game to the end no matter what, and other ones, like Robert, understanding his position in the game and knowing that going to game 2 is what he has to do to win. So we'll get to see the players shuffling a little bit in mulligans here, just getting everything ready for game 2. But quite a commanding win from the side. I think the names got flipped over just a second ago, but
yeah, I was trying to, as far as, because it looked like Jack had ended up conceding that last game, and then but the Robert and the names. So sometimes
we'll
they flip.
Names. Yeah, we'll say that these are locked in. We'll say that Robert actually ended up getting the first one, and we'll just go by his deck combination. Amber Steel just looking like it had enough combination of removal and threats in order to get him through it. And again, it goes back to having the right answers as well, like that beast that you were mentioning before. And we get to see, ooh, okay, so fish into Simba. So a good 1-2 start from the side of Jack, and this is exactly what he needs in order to get onto the board early and not let some of Robert's options like develop. So we're going to see how well can Robert actually deal with these early game threats, and he has chosen to use Prince Eric to do that.
Prince Eric, one of those steel cards that with that challenging ability can be useful in at least trying to even out and trade one character for one character, as long as you make sure to do so on your turn. And Jack, speaking a bit more about his deck as far as the kind of cheaper characters coming through. You know, you have these fills, these stitches, and obviously Flounder that we see here. Different than when you see the Simba paired with a Lilo or something, for instance. But Lilo, I feel like, was the talk of the town for a while in general in the early portions of the Amber games.
So having an Amber card, because of the power level of Amber cards in general and the access to Simba, something like a 2-questing power on a 1-drop, you know, being able to curve out Lilo into the Simba is an incredibly powerful play. In this case, you know, Flounder not having that much questing power, but again, still safe behind the Simba, and especially if the opponent wants to use something like his Eric in order to train to the Flounder, not that big of a loss. You only lost your 1-drop, but got a little bit of lore behind it, so not too terrible to have it as your 1-drop of choice here.
Yeah. Looks like Robert ended up inking a Cerberus 3 in the well and a Tinkerbell. So
you feel a lot about that card.
Well, I'm thinking more about the big tink that can come later on every time I see the early. And when you see Steel, you expect some version of Tinkerbell to be in there to be able to have that on 6 or to shift up at 4, which is what you have to be wary of if you're on the side of Jack.
So that is actually the biggest power for the 3-drop Tinkerbell, is being able to turn into the 6-drop Tinkerbell for as low as 4 cost. So that is something that Jack is going to have to be aware of over the course of the next few turns, even as early as next turn. And something like a Tinkerbell shifting here would actually deal with the entire board on the other side quite effectively. So let's see if Robert actually has that card, and it'll be an incredible inflection point in the game here. And it might even solidify his 2-0 victory. So we make sure, so he's actually inking Rapunzel, and this might actually indicate that shifting play like we mentioned before.
There you go.
So
big tink coming through.
Tinkerbell enjoyer on my side over here.
I think it's a little bit of nostalgia too, because I got the fancy Tinkerbell on one of my first drafts that I did of Lorcana. No, not the super duper, but you know, I was like, oh my gosh, look, I went to a draft today. And I was running Amethyst Steel at the time, so I was actually running Tinkerbell. So I was like, oh, I got the pretty one.
You get double excited for pulling in and for the fact that you actually
I needed another one at the time. Yeah, it was the double whammy. So I think you get a little attached to. Do you have any nostalgia cards, even in Lorcana, as new as it is? But are there any that kind of jumped out to you when you first started playing, and you think that this resonates with me?
So definitely, I very much enjoyed the Elsa. 8-drop Elsa is one of my favorites. Most of the time, I do tend to look at cards from the perspective of power level first and then lore second, but in the case of Elsa, it actually has best of both worlds, as it is an Elsa card of her just doing her ice thing while at the same time being incredibly powerful in the card game itself. So a great card all around, and that's one of my picks.
Yeah, great card indeed. We're getting a break from Elsa during this matchup, though. No Amethyst present. So
another card that's incredibly powerful as well, especially in these Amber strategies, is this Aerial, being able to not only search for your different songs, but as well as playing the Steel songs, which are normally a little bit clunky as a 5 cost, but being able to cast them for free is really powerful for this Aerial. So one of the main reasons to be in this color combination all around.
That's when you're thinking of the grab your swords and all of the good things that can come out of Steel. Because that is when you're talking about removal in Lorcana, there are different variants, obviously, right? Very familiar for card game players. You look at Ruby and it's, here's this hard removal. But a lot of tick damage for anything from Steel, whether it's Tinkerbell getting those pings, if you're running Hans and are able to ping things off. So if you plan on facing some aggressive variants or these lower willpower characters, it can be an advantage for sure. And I think that's what Robert is thinking when you're looking at some of the characters that Jack has been throwing down. Now getting to the bigger bodies with that 7-cost Hades.
Yes, so he did not have it in Game 1, but now he gets to do it in Game 2 in a very pivotal moment where he gets to solidify his control over the game while at the same time questing a little bit in order to really get a little bit of ahead. Now he's at 5 to his opponent's 0, and I do want to see how explosive Robert's turn can be, again, with this aerial that can sing a 5-drop song, can he wrestle back control of the board while at the same time developing some sort of a threat? And how slow can he actually take this turn? Do get to see in his hand. Oh, okay. This is going to be Tink into Prince Eric. Not the most explosive turn, but he is, setting up his cards in order to trade into potentially this Hades on the way back. So.
And trying to get a peek of what's in hand.
Oh, and there is Grab Your Swords being able to be sung with this area, like we mentioned before, being able to develop 2 threats and at the same time playing Grab Your Swords in what is very timely because it gets to deal with this Phil that has a lot of power with its support ability and at the same time chip damaging, like you were mentioning before, the other 2 cards in play. And very emphatic use of the second Hades as well.
It is kind of that double up on the value that you get, as you're saying. Not only do you get the removal by singing the song with Grab Your Sword, but by getting those, even though they're smaller bodies, down, you're posing somewhat of a threat, forcing the Hades to go ahead and push that back into your hand, which also just messes with your curve a bit, messes with your resource allocation.
And it's very important to note that the second Hades actually targeted not the aerial, which can sing songs like A Whole New World, which would be quite good in this scenario. He actually opted to get rid of the Tinkerbell, and that's a nod again to the possibility of a second larger Tinkerbell. Just getting rid of that sort of rush mechanic where if you shift into a card that's already been in play, you can actually attack with it on the same turn. So very astute play there. And again, those smaller creatures trading up with the Hades and then playing Captain Hook.
Captain Hook has
not the greatest bomb,
play.
right?
Yeah.
Only a 1-drop for right now, so we're gonna have to see if he top decks a few more cards, maybe to draw cards, but he can't top deck something like a Rapunzel. He's gonna need A Whole New World, I think.
That's why I couldn't quite find Robert's deck list earlier. Oh, but maybe since the name switches, let me see. Because I didn't see with. Okay, here we go.
I would hope that he has at least 2 to 4 copies, depending on what type of build he's chosen to play today, and it would be quite timely in this situation, as the game is getting away from him a little bit, and he actually, and now that you pulled it up, does not have access to that card. So he's chosen for a little bit more of a much more mid-rangey version of this sort of strategy, saying, okay, I don't want to give my opponent 7 cards in hand. Instead, I'm going to use something like Surfing Stitch in order to draw my cards, but Surfing Stitch not being an option right now, so do get to see if he has other top decks available. The Hades that we were talking about before would be quite good. Hades into maybe buying back that aerial card. Trying to find another Grab Your Swords, but he is falling so far behind already. Jack being at 13 lore from what it looks like, so he does have to find one of those big top decks at this exact moment. Jack doesn't have cards in hand at all, so this would be the perfect time to find one of those haymaker cards, and at the same time Server is dealing with the board quite well, and we do get to see a 2 questing power card in Beast, so not too terrible.
Robert starting to build back his board just a tad. Maleficent on the side of Jack. We talked in game number 1 how valuable she can be. So the bodies are getting bigger on both sides. And I think it's also interesting to note, I've seen so many more of these Amber Steel decks go towards the variant that doesn't have A Whole New World and leans more on You Have Forgotten Me, kind of choosing one or the other. And that's off of recent play and tournament play. But I also feel like just ramping up over time because of the chaotic nature of A Whole New World, if you will.
Yeah, the chaotic nature of A Whole New World, it not necessarily always being good for you in the sense that you could actually be in control of the game, having multiple cards in hand versus the opponent's less cards, and now it's just a dead card in hand. At the same time, if both players need to refuel, you give your opponent the first shot of using those new 7 cards. So players opting instead to have a lot more control over the kind of card advantage cards that they see with these Hades and these Stitches and even these aerials. Adding copies of Hakuna Matata that Aerial can search in order to ink as well is one of the great additions that I've seen in these Amber Steel decks. So I do like the player agency when it comes to this sort of a deck build, but again, not having access to that draw 7. Proving detrimental here as Robert is unable to stop Jack over the course of the next turn, gaining those last few points of lore. And we do get the game going to a 1-1. So that's good for us as we get more Lorcana action in general. But we have seen now Jack, the sort of the good and the bad when it comes to how his deck can curve out or sometimes run out of steam. So in that game, he didn't run out of steam. He was able to capitalize on his advantage over the board in order to close out the game before Robert could mount some sort of a comeback. And at the same time, we did see Robert not finding those card advantage cards in the mid game to get him back, especially that turn that he had where he used aerial to sing grab your swords. He was only able to follow up with something like a Prince and a Tinkerbell, not some sort of another haymaker like the larger Tinkerbell, for example. So that would have been a little bit better for him, but didn't have access to those cards. So we get to see a little bit of how the matchup goes. It's very back and forth, but again, Robert in particular has to get value out of those grab your swords in order to eke out the board.
Yeah, it felt like the hands in general, when you're comparing game 2 to game 1. Game 1, we saw the very moment Jack ran out of steam, right? I don't really have much else that I can play, and then Robert had a clear hand advantage. But once they both started top decking, is who's in the better position here? Who has the early lead and can get something down that can keep that?
And in those scenarios, that's why when both players are at 0 or only 1 card in hand, those 3 questing power cards, like the Maleficent that we saw top decked at the end, is basically saying you have to deal with this card every single turn or it's just going to win the game. And that's one of the powers of the Sapphire color in general. And in this matchup in particular, both players playing Amber, but one choosing Sapphire over Steel. Steel, like you were mentioning before, doesn't have that hard removal. So the 6 willpower from a card like Hades and from a card like Maleficent really mattering in this matchup.
You find yourself needing to take multiple rounds to be able to get that removal down because of that tick damage, as opposed to something that is immediate and fully effective. And Robert, understanding that, said Jack is at 15 lore. Yeah. There is no way for me to be able to stop this from happening. Obviously, that one went even farther than the game previously and was pretty well decided by the end. But Jack now looking to repeat the fortunes of the previous game. We'll see if Robert can disrupt him, though, and bring it back.
And we do see that Robert is actually on the play. Incredibly important to go first in a matchup like this because now he has the answer to the Simba already in play in the form of Eric, so he won't suffer too much from attacking with the Eric and dealing with the Stitch. The Stitch only gaining 1 lore in the end, so, play draw also allows you to play something like the arrow on this turn. We're going to see if he actually has access to that, and actually inking something like the big Tink lets me believe that he doesn't. We're going to see what kind of song. Hopefully he doesn't whiff on this search right here.
That's always the worry.
Yes.
Fingers crossed. Please give me some kind of song.
He does. Okay.
Ooh.
So unable to find a song in this situation, that might be, definitely going to be detrimental, but we'll get to see if he runs out of steam. Robert does during the course of this game because of something like whiffing that. And now, does Jack actually worry less about something like Grab Your Swords, knowing that something like the Song Aerial has whiffed? Either way, both of his cards in play actually have 3 willpower, so not worried too much about that.
Yep. 2 versus 3 makes all the difference when you're on the early turns of this game. Not many of the cheaper characters having the ability to take that out in a single swoop. That's why Simba being able to block all those 2/2s and 1/1s can be very valuable. Now getting taken out by Ariel. Little side note on Ariel. I think that I'm very excited to see what comes through in the next chapters, because I can imagine a super duper song heavy deck across the line. We're already seeing kind of itching towards that, and as more cards are revealed, I expect more to come.
And I agree with you 100%. The excitement level comes from the fact that any time a song that costs 5 or less is released into the game, this aerial gains more power, and it can both search it as well as play it for free. So this aerial just really good in terms of like the deck construction, but also for the future of the game as well. So, and we could get an aerial that shifts onto it as well.
Yes.
So it could do something like sing and then shift into a gigantic aerial. So I do want to see that in the future as well. In the meantime, we do get to see that Robert actually resolved the Rapunzel to get a little bit extra value off of the aerial attack, like you mentioned before. And now he is at 5 ink, and I don't know what he played, but I think it was a beast, if I'm not mistaken. 1 turn away from the critical big Tinkerbell, and I want to see how Jack responds here, because Jack, again, being on the draw, not as ahead as he was in game 2. He does have a pretty respectable board, but I do want to see something like that Maleficent that we've seen before come down in this turn.
At this point, if you're looking at Jack, you're hoping for either a significant lore advantage or a big progression in your Inkwell. Yes. And right now, the fact that it's almost even on both fronts, even the board itself in terms of number of characters, that's where you get a little dicey feeling if you're in the spot of Jack.
You definitely do feel like, other than the Hades, the 7-drop Hades that we saw before from Sapphire, the steel color has a little bit more late game power with something like those tinks, and just being able to grab your swords, deal with a wider board. So the wider the boards get, the more value that something like grab your swords gets. So definitely Jack wants to find some sort of commanding lead, and he decides that this is the moment that he wants to go sideways with all his cards, going to 5 lore, and we're going to have to see how Robert actually deals with this powerful board from the other side. And it was actually a Cerberus that was played onto the table. That Cerberus trading with Rapunzel quite well.
It does make sense to go ahead and just start questing if you're Jack, because if you are worried about that grab your sword, there's nothing you can really do to prevent when it comes out. And the last thing you want is, I sat on my characters and did nothing with them because I was trying to protect them. Jack, smart player, obviously, here competing in this tournament, knows to attempt to get as much value as possible and assume that Robert has a grab your sword at the ready with that aerial as well, and having already seen it in action. But some damage has been dealt over to characters for Robert, and Jack is trying to make his way back. Not quite limited in hand just yet, but something to consider later.
And I do want to see how... Oh, and there's the big tank coming down, just dealing a little bit of chip damage. And like you were mentioning before, getting the value out of the cards in play is important, you know, when you have access to them. And him just deciding, okay, they're probably not going to get much more valuable than this in the future, so I'm just going to turn them sideways right now. And that large Tinkerbell on the other side going to dominate this board. So how fast can Jack try to close this out at 5 lore? We're going to have to see what his options are.
Yeah, Jack cares much more about playing against the race of time than Robert does, who just wants to try to slow Jack's effort. Now that Tink is down, though, you do have, you don't have the hard removal to take down the Maleficents, but you do have a bigger body that can go ahead and use that additional ability of taking out a unit and dealing 2 damage. That's one way that you can start having more of an impact against these Maleficents. But as we noted before, if you let Jack kind of get to that much later, around the mid-teens point, even one round of passing and Maleficent getting the chance to quest with 3 becomes such a huge threat. So Robert wanting to keep him from double digits. And
how does Robert actually assign damage here? Does he deal with this Stitch, or does he decide to actually attack Rapunzel into the Stitch and then use that 2 damage on something like a Maleficent and deal with Maleficent with something like grab your swords later? He does actually opt to use the Rapunzel to remove the Stitch. Already attacking cards that have quested and are sideways is a pretty effective way of controlling the board, and then, you know, leaving something like damage removal for these untapped Maleficents. But again, Maleficent having 6 willpower, just so difficult to chip away at in this case. But how many 3 and 2 questing power cards can Jack actually produce with only 3 cards in hand? That's going to be the question.
Yeah, that's the difficulty here.
Oh, and an incredibly powerful discarding 2 from the side of Jack, and Jack needed every single resource available to him, but now he has 2 less cards to work with.
Interesting. You have forgotten me. The value of this card definitely increases the less cards your opponent has in their hands.
Yeah, depending on the context of the game, the card can be absolutely backbreaking, especially if Jack wants to do this sort of racing situation where he says, okay, I'm just going to let your board live. You can deal with my cards however you choose, but every single one of my cards is questing every turn. But now, if you have 2 less of those cards to quest with, do you actually have enough time to win the game? And he actually says, okay, he has a decent amount of rebuild with this Robin Hood. This Robin Hood drawing him an extra card. Drawing cards in blue, very rare, so the Robin Hood, a great option to do that with, and a great inclusion in this situation here. So,
and worth noting, conditional draw, though. So here it worked out for him, but I think that's sometimes what can make Sapphire feel very explosive in moments. You know, we talk about the bell combos and, you know, oh, you got the draw with the Robin Hood and all these things. But when that doesn't work out, then you're not accessing a lot of the utility of your cards. So I'm sure Jack feels good about getting to do so now. It was starting to get closer in lore, but into those double digits he has crested now at 12 compared to 5 for Robert. But still some options for Robert to bring through. Lots of damage dealt to the characters across.
Yeah, and Robert, again, actually does have a decent amount of cards in play and a decent amount of questing power as well. So can he actually balance dealing damage to Jack's board while at the same time questing on his side as well. And can he actually propose to win the race? He already has 5 questing power in play. As long as he removes this Maleficent before the turn is over, and he's going to do that with a Grab Your Swords, being able to deal with that and chip damage a little bit of the Robin Hood. And now he gets 4 lore, presumably, if he taps down these 2 characters on his side. But again, he is still at 5, so he has to try to come back into the game somehow. And this strategy is working. Jack, again, he looked a little bit at a deficit when he was only at 5 lore a few turns ago, and he was kind of losing control of the game. But again, this reckless, play every single threat out every single turn and deal with it somehow strategy that he's implementing here alongside that extra draw from the Robin Hood is really keeping him in the game. And as long as Robert doesn't cobble together a way to win in one turn, then I think Jack might have just enough time to get there. But we're going to have to see what Jack has left after that You Have Forgotten Me.
Yeah, that I think having that draw in that moment did do a decent amount to offset the play of Robert there. But still, even with that considered, you're starting to see the hand get thinner and thinner. And Robert, I feel as he pushes up his sleeves, doesn't seem to be too worried just yet. Because for Jack also, when you're looking at the threats that Robert's bringing through, and I like thinking from this angle of removal. And yeah, you have the semi-removal, Hades coming through or Let It Go, but when you're kind of comparing removal on both sides, I feel like he's focused on how many Grab Your Swords have been brought out. How many times has Robert already made his play to clear my board? Can I start building it up again?
Yeah, and we do get to see here, he's trying to go, Robert is trying to go for this win in one turn plan and actually forcing Jack to, instead of quest with his Robin Hood, having to remove the Rapunzel because of that threat of winning as soon as the following turn. So Robert doing a good job of almost forcing Jack to pivot from his original plan, and Jack actually choosing to discard 2 cards from Robert's hand instead of developing a threat here. And that just might be a consequence of him running a little bit out of steam here. Yeah. And we get to see Robert just going sideways with everything.
I do feel like it looks different than the previous loss Jack had in this series, but I do feel like we've hit that point of critical mass again. Resources have been expelled. Whenever you have to pivot your strategy, just as you said, from what you were planning to just denying the opponent, you're no longer working into your own win conditions. You're not building up that lore. You still haven't cleared the board. There's a big tink. Ariel's still chilling. Everyone's hanging out, and Robert has advantage in multiple ways.
Yeah, so here Hades is going to do his best to try to bring back, at this point, the only card that he can cast from the discard pile would be a Stitch, but instead he grabs a Robin Hood, inks it, and is going to play another resource. Just a desperate attempt at making a small final push, but again, Robert's board just too intimidating at this point, and I do believe he just turns everything sideways and takes the matchup home, but he's going to go through the motions here really quick. BR guessing just to see what options he has available to him, but he does, I believe, does he have 6 available to him? I do think so. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Maybe he's 1 off and he's just trying to make sure that he covers all of his bases. But it does seem like Robert is in a commanding lead at this point.
Because when you're only 1 off, there's no need to really force the 5 lore that you have right now. You might as well conserve those resources so you can go for the 1 big swing the next time around, which looks like it's what Robert is attempting to do. Jack's somewhat building back up, using the Hades to get some more cards to his name. But nonetheless, I feel more than the other matches we have witnessed today, this one, because of the nature of where Sapphire and Amber together stand, you just felt that pivot point. You felt that big turn from, oh, maybe Jack can win this, to, oh, nope, don't see where the angle is to come back.
Yeah, and it's a consequence. Oh, and there it is. So Robert takes the matchup 2-1, and it was a back-and-forth matchup, and the first matchup to actually not be a 2-0, at least that I've seen so far. Again, it goes back to that turning point like you mentioned, and it felt like a lot of the times it was Big Tinkerbell hitting play, and just how much board control that card represents, forcing the other player to try to win the game almost in this rush style, but being unable to because he was only at 5 lore at the time. So again, Jack not crossing the finish line, Robert getting there, and just overall a cool matchup to see 2 different styles of Amber going head to head.
I'm glad that we've gotten variation across all of our matches so far today. You know, we started with the mirror, and then Amber Steel we're going to see a lot of, but we at least get variation within the deck as well. And I think that when talking about that big Tinkerbell going down for Robert, it wasn't just that threat, but the timing. He ended up coming into it early enough where the units on Jack's side were very targetable, very easy to take care of. Even the Maleficents, when it got a little dicey, he still had some way to be able to answer them. Combos with Grab Your Sword. The Aerials, of course, didn't manage to get a song to start, so it started a little bit with that rocky footing of, oh no, she didn't get me what I needed, but beyond that still had a lot of purpose.
And Robert making sure to understand, like, okay, I did whiff on this card. I might run out of resources a little bit sooner, but as long as he has just enough resources to deal with what's happening on the other side, he shouldn't get tilted. Just play it to where you know your deck can do. Understand that you have other card advantage engines that are not just the aerial, and at the same time, hopefully you'll top deck or have one of those Grab Your Swords later on in the game. So just good in identifying the fact that the game isn't over just because you whiff on one song, and bringing the game to a close there pretty convincing fashion after that Tinkerbell came down. At the same time, the main difference between game 2 and 3, that Maleficent coming down, it wasn't as impactful when you're at lower. Being able, if you have something like 10 and 11 lore like there was in game 2, that Maleficent actually knockout punch, being able to close out the game, but not enough in game 3.
Yeah, 3 lore points when you're kind of in the middle portion of accruing your lore. Yeah. You're not at double digits or you just hit it. Not nearly as much of a threat when you can say, oh, 1 to 2 quests from this character ends up ending the game, so you have to answer in this moment. It gave Robert that room to leave them be and build out his own board when he decided to do so.
And we can see that kind of strategy working in an Amber Sapphire shell, but Emerald can also do a lot of what that Sapphire strategy is doing because of those 3 questing threats. So again, bringing that color back into the fold. But overall, love to see the underrepresented Sapphire being 3-0 in this case, and then obviously inevitably falling to the Steel strategy, but just good to see that a strategy like that is performing well at an event of this caliber. So good on both players there. Well played, taking the match to game 3, but again, Steel eking out a little bit in the end.
Yeah, just a tad. And we noted at the beginning of the match that it is very important to get those wins now because this was round 4, which means we are getting into that elimination range. Over 200 participants here today. Only top 16 make it to tomorrow. So a couple of losses in some of these rounds, and you're on very thin ice.
And you want to mention, obviously the caliber of players in this event is incredibly high, but the more that you go undefeated in this event, even better the competition becomes. And if you lose the earlier rounds and then you rattle off some wins, you still have to get through some incredibly difficult opponents in those round 7s and round 8s. So being able to drop a game in that round 7, round 8 is a lot better than in these earlier rounds. So just making sure you get all the wins possible, always good. And good on Robert for doing that. But we're going to go into round 5 shortly. And
yeah, that's what it sounds like coming through. While we're waiting for that, I did want to look at, I just want to see what kind of Sapphire decks are here. If I can spell, as I've had difficulty with throughout the day.
And that's a really good part of an event like this, obviously with Best Coast Experience, being able to have access to all the different kinds of deck lists. And just seeing the just seeing the innovations from the different kinds of players here. And again, we saw in that game, Robert didn't actually have a whole new world in his strategy, just more focused on the slow and steady nickel and dime aspect of the Amber Steel color, just making sure that all his cards at least go +1 or even, and that's just good enough. He said, I don't have to refill my whole hand if all my cards are pretty decently valued. So not needing it there, and yeah, we see that innovation coming through. So maybe a whole new world, seen as pivotal in the beginning, not as pivotal, right now.
And it feels like when you see these changes, there's usually one style that kind of leads to that waterfall effect. Yes. And Ruby Amethyst coming through, slowing things down. Then some of the decks wanted to respond with, how can I also slow things down? How can I have my own form of denial, even if it's not direct board denial, then card denial or things of that sort. So going away from a whole new world against decks that are so eager to draw. I mean, we all love draw, right?
Yes.
But some that struggle with it, then it feels like you're giving them an advantage. And even if they don't struggle with it, you're thinking, okay,
and it might be a
well,
consequence of decks moving to the 4 full copies of You Have Forgotten Me. So that
Yes.
card much less effective if you're giving your opponent 7 cards back. In this case, being able to deny your opponent multiple cards with You Have Forgotten Me and then drawing with your other cards like Ariel. Just a little bit more controlled, like you mentioned before. It's not as chaotic of a game state, and you get to actually control a lot more of the cards that you see. So overall, that might be a consequence. Just that discard 2 effect we saw in that game, incredibly powerful. But that might have even been the nail in the coffin that made Jack unable to close it out, because he did have 3 to 4 cards in hand at that time, and maybe those cards give him enough questing power to win. But after that, You Have Forgotten Me, it wasn't good enough. So.
yeah, that's a very important thing to point out, the relationship between A Whole New World and You Have Forgotten Me, kind of the dyssynergy or the lack of synergy
Yes.
between them if you do play them. I was trying to look up because there were 2 variants of the Amber Steel deck in the 2K qualifier not that long ago that I think they had a 9-card differential. Like, it was
Okay.
actually a pretty big spread
Yeah.
between the 2 different decks, even though they had the same exact ink. And I think that shows just how much versatility, especially in that combo. And I'm sure there's that same versatility in other combos as not just other cards are released, but more discovery. We're still somewhere in that stage, but this in particular feels like it.
And at what point in the metagame are we as well, if you see it in terms of a spectrum? So like I mentioned before, a card like A Whole New World might have been better earlier on, but because of consequences of something like You Have Forgotten Me, just the deck trends change and the matchups getting used to something like the red-purple deck. If everything is control, I want to play some anti-control cards, and that shifts the metagame in a certain direction as well. So a lot of things go into what these players think about, especially at this level. How do I gain the most advantage, and where do I want to be in that spectrum? So.
Yeah, and that's why, speaking of kind of that speed, and how you're saying the control decks have slowed down, it makes me think of the ones that are trying to go a bit faster with, Amethyst and Emerald.
Yes.
And we haven't seen any Emerald on the stream
I know.
today.
I know.
Oh, yeah, what's that? I know.
It's not like I'm keeping track, but at some point it'll happen.
Yeah, are you a big Emerald fan?
I just feel like anything that's the aggressive or the aggro deck in a game is what I subscribe to the most, and I feel like the best representation of an aggressive strategy in this game is something like Sapphire and something like Emerald. That combination has a lot of 3 questing power cards. Obviously, questing power, how you determine how fast your deck is. If you get to win quickly, that's obviously speed. So I do want to see that color combination happen. For example, that would be great if we do get to see a blue-green deck at some point in the day. But any Emerald is enjoyable at this point.
Any Emeralds, anybody come through.
And one of the main reasons why I do like this sort of aggressive outlook is because I don't think that control is unfun by any means. I just feel like it gives you a lot more player agency when all your cards are accessible as early as turn 1. If you have a lot of 1-drops, a lot of 2-drops, you can play them a lot more during the course of the game, and that leads to a lot more decision-making points, and that's what I enjoy about card games in general. That's why I like aggro mostly. But if you have one big bomb a turn, it's only one player, right? Even though it is kind of exciting when you throw a Maleficent out there.
Yeah.
So I do agree. But
so do you mostly play aggro when you're playing yourself?
Definitely. All the aggro decks. When I played card games, besides Lorcana over the course of my career, I definitely like the aggressive strategies the most. Yes. Every now and then I've sat there and done the do nothing strategies over and over, but for the most part, I do like to, in this case, not attacking, it's questing, but,
I can respect that. I always do love watching the aggressive decks, but I end up being more of a control player myself. Which then I kind of feel some type of way when, when Ruby Amethyst is... I'm just so controlling. No, not really. But, the Ruby Amethyst being so popular, it's the kind of thing where, but I always like control anyway. But I don't want it to seem like I'm just trying to play the strongest thing. So I was trying a lot of other control decks and things too to get around playing it for a while.
From, like, the tier 1 deck? Is that normally what you try to do? Just like I'm gonna play not the most popular deck in the room. I don't want to be one of them as well.
Right.
So just something a little bit more original. I can see that.
I do a lot of, it depends on kind of what's on the docket, right? If I'm wanting to try and really grind out, then I'll pick my deck that I'm going with. But, for instance, before an event like this, I'm much more focused on playing most of the decks and
then seeing where
getting
you want to
the
fall.
overall feel. Yeah, because I think it also improves your gameplay a lot. I feel like there's the two sides, right? You want to have the strategy that you're most comfortable with, that you know in and out, that you don't even have to think about certain aspects.
A lot of muscle memory that
Yep.
goes into that.
But it also always helps to play the other decks that
Yes.
you're going against to kind of get a feel for their cadence. And you get that even when playing against them, but there is something about actually, on your own time, getting the feel when they're in your hands,
There are
mulligan and
definitely
everything.
finer details that go into understanding a deck when you play it and understanding especially how they lose, right? Because if you can play a strategy and be on the losing side of playing that strategy, now when you're on the other side, you understand how you were beat that one time and you can replicate that from the other side. So definitely playing the matchup from both sides helps a lot in a game like this, especially when there's so many decision-making points. So yeah, just understanding the different matchups from that aspect is cool. So.
Yeah. I know. I'm excited to find out what our next matchup is going to end up being. I'm trying to think green thoughts.
Green thoughts.
I see a green shirt. I see a green binder.
Money anywhere?
There's not enough. I know. I'm like,
Is there money?
well, there was money here. I saw y'all picking up the Cusco card that was here. There's Cusco and some cash here.
We have the register right in front of us, actually.
Yeah,
There you go. There's green over there.
It's for the stream, guys. It's for the stream. We're trying to bring the green for the stream.
Bring the box over here.
Yeah. But I do think that would be fun to see some Emerald, because when these first came through, and you could almost create some solitaire feeling Emerald decks, because it's all about just trying to quest. But then when you go to the aggro variant, then it adds a whole new dynamic, and
especially with the keyword ward too, like ward being able to stop your opponent from targeting most of the threats that you put in play. Something like Cusco comes to mind. That does lend itself to the sort of solitaire aspect. That's the most controlling green will get, I guess.
Yeah. That's the closest you get. And Cusco is one of those characters that can just be a threat in himself when you get to the mid to late portion of the game, because of that lack of targetability. It cuts into Dragonfire. Be Prepared is the card that just gets around all of those because of not actually targeting any characters in particular. But if you can get close to that kind of finisher, then Cusco just has such stickiness for at least one turn.
Another card that I enjoyed a lot as well is Mad Hatter. Being able to draw cards in the green color is also pretty cool. And both of those are 5-drops. So.
Yeah. Do you like the kind of like the Cheshire Cats, like the
Cheshire Cats of the world?
yeah, the where you're really forcing your opponent, the Corollas, the things that get you as the opposition to think of using some of your more utility of songs and things, as opposed to just slamming in and either getting your character banished, or maybe you have to get a card discarded. There's a lot of those within Emerald that I think can be a very annoying experience for the opponent in a good way for yourself.
Yeah, so the only time I ever subscribe to effects like that where the opponent gets to decide the outcome of a certain board state, I like to think about it as if it's an extra ability. So for example, Cheshire Cat being a 3-drop, 3-will card that gives you 2 questing power, already good in its own right. If it was something like a vanilla, it would be decently fringe playable. And then just getting that effect that the opponent has to play around that sort of banish ability is actually, I see it as an extra plus. I don't even care what they use to deal with it. It's already a good card in its own right, and then it gets that plus. So that's mostly the only time that I want to let my opponent make the decisions when it comes to the board. If it's something that's already good for me, and then it just gets better with that additional effect. So I do enjoy Cheshire Cat as one of the only options that green has right now. And I do like pairing green with something that has a lot more to offer in the 3-drop slot. But for the most part, yes, I think Cheshire Cat is a decent card. So.
Yeah, you mentioned that you like to see Emerald with Sapphire, so 3-drops. You're thinking the Mickeys.
The Mickey of the world, yes. Mickey being one of my favorite cards, not only does it give a little bit of card advantage that green is missing, but at the same time, it lets you go from 3 to 5. 3 being one of the mana ink like slots in the game that green suffers at, only having Cheshire Cat in that slot, and at the same time skipping 4 and going into 5, which is the Cuscos of the world, the Mad Hatters of the world. So Mickey into one of those very powerful 5-cost cards is something that I enjoy.
Yeah, and 3 and 5 are always the big breaking points, right? 4 is that one that you can kind of. You still want something on the curve sometimes, but in the cases where you're saying if you already have a deck that is planning to ramp and you don't have to be sticking over on 4 and then be worried about not playing something. You can just get to 5 quicker.
Another really powerful card that I think of when I think of skipping the turn 3 is Just in Time, being able to play the amber color with green and being able to cheat into play one of those very powerful 5-drops. So just a lot of options that you have to combine with that color combination. And in general, it just leads to a lot of fun deck building in Lorcana. Even though there's only one set available for the game right now, there's just so much versatility that one can have when looking into these different color combinations. So, and set 2 is only going to amplify that. So.
I do want to know, because when you and Dan were here earlier talking about the reveals thus far for Chapter 2, when I'm standing out there, I can't actually hear it because it's not going out to house. I just see y'all talking about it, and I go and I watch over the shoulder and look at OBS to see what cards you're talking about. But any big highlights from you for anybody that's been tuning in since then as far as the cards that you're looking forward to?
I very much like the mouse armor. Being able to give sort of an extra point of protection to various cards that exist already in the game, making those 3 willpower cards in particular not that susceptible to smash anymore, and I think that's going to be a great breaking point for a lot of cards that exist right now, but also that are going to release into the future. If a lot of cards that are effectively 3 willpower can become 4 willpower, that just changes the game in a dramatic way. So I do think that mouse armor is one of the highlights from the reveals that we saw earlier. And those reveals were very genuine. I had not seen any of those cards before that reveal. So
Stream
pretty
got
cool.
the first impressions,
yes,
huh?
So very much the first impressions of those.
Lucky peeps, lucky peeps.
I do hope that I don't whiff on any of those predictions.
But that, I feel like, is the joy whenever reveals like this come through. Sometimes there's a pressure felt of, oh, I need to predict how this is going to be within the meta. But if you watch all of the reveal commentary in any game that anyone offers, usually there is quite a bit of variance, whether it is among those that are commenting on the reveals or what actually happens when everything comes into play.
And how people feel in general about how they receive it. And it's a consequence of the hidden gems, right? So the hidden gems, you think that the format is going to be set in stone in a particular way because these cards look face value so powerful, and then there's this hidden card that no one thought about, has like this secret synergy with other cards that already exist in the game, and then it shifts the format completely in another direction, and the game just becomes brand new even though it's only set 2. So I do enjoy that sort of like reveal aspect. So
I think that's why things like introducing a new keyword in Resist are so important to note when you're looking forward to Chapter 2 beyond just the cards themselves, because that adds an entirely different dynamic when you're going against Resist units, that being that units with Resist, then they mitigate some X number of damage every time damage is dealt to them, and that can really stack up.
From the game design perspective, when you add an entire keyword to a game, you have to think about not only that keyword and how it works on the cards that the keyword is on, but how every single interaction with those cards is going to work. And so both in synergies and what the opponents can do against those kind of cards. So definitely a lot of balancing goes into these brand new keywords, but a lot of innovation comes with it as well. And it makes games a lot less linear, and that's why a game like Lorcana is so cool. There's so many keywords in set 1 and set 2, and it just allows for a lot of like building possibilities.
Yeah, I'm sure we'll see things shake up pretty significantly once we get our hands on Chapter 2. Checking in with chat a little bit to see what y'all are talking about. It seems they were commenting also on Emerald and some of the cards to
so
be
we have
bringing.
Emerald enjoyers out there, so I'm not the only one.
I do think, I actually, because I have a friend here that is playing, and I lent some of my cards. So as a result, I had to go to. Yes, I'm sponsoring a player, and I typically don't play Emerald, but I wanted a deck to play while my cards are being used.
That makes sense.
So I have one I'll have to try out at some point, at least in person, of Amethyst Emerald deck.
I hope you don't mean that friends don't lend friends Emerald. Is that what you're saying? You kept the Emerald instead.
Friends, no, this particular competitor wanted to do the Amber Steel,
okay.
so it just happens to be.
Very competitive. He wants to win, that's for sure.
Yep.
The deck super represented in the floor today is actually the first highest represented deck on the floor, and it's a consequence of it just having so many good finishes and so many first places and second places over the course of the last few months. So definitely one of the best decks in the floor right now, and we got to see it as soon as last game. It's 1-2-1, and it's looking really strong in the 4-0 bracket, so got to be very prepared for those Amber Steel decks out there.
Yeah. Nobody's as prepared as Ruby players, though.
They're told constantly to be prepared, yes.
Yeah, constantly. That's actually one of my favorite songs in Disney.
Is it really?
Yeah, because I'm a big Scar fan.
Have you practiced it before?
I haven't outwardly practiced in terms of actually doing a cover, but I've definitely sang it a bunch just for fun. It's probably one of my most for fun sing along to songs. I'm a villain
Do you only,
enjoyer.
do you only sing the songs when you watch the movies, or do you casually find yourself singing them like when you're doing
I'll
extra
go on
things?
kicks. Yeah.
Okay.
Or sometimes if I'm in the mood to watch a movie and then I'll watch it, and then for the next coming weeks I'll kind of revisit through, music streaming. Be like, I'm in this
Wait, so
mood for a
villains,
while.
which villains do you like the most?
Villains.
You did mention
Well,
Cruella de Vil before, so maybe that's one of them?
yeah, I think she's an interesting one just because, growing up, it was like, how can anyone hurt dogs? Like, that just felt like the most evil.
Evil thing ever, yeah.
You could, even though there's other ones where kingdoms are falling
Yeah, I
and
know.
people are being banished and voices taken away and just complete denial of their way of living, but it's
the
like
Dalmatian cruelty not
dogs.
allowed at all.
Yeah. I mean, come on, we gotta protect the doggos, right? You a dog fan?
Taking over kingdoms, totally fine. Don't mess with the dogs in the
Yeah,
kingdoms,
take over
please.
the world, take over the universe. I don't care. Just leave the dogs alone, okay?
I enjoy doggos, but I like cats the most. So in the
Ah.
next set, there's actually a bunch of different cats that are coming out, and mostly creatures in general. There was a lot of Merlin shifting into different animals in the reveals, so those are pretty interesting. I'm mostly a fake Disney fan. I think I like the more like mainstream ones, but when it comes to like the shows that there used to be in the 90s and stuff like that, maybe I know a little bit less than a lot of the enjoyers out there. So I'm definitely from these cards actually learning a lot about the Disney universe and world and things
Yeah.
like that. And that's one of the things that I enjoy the most about engaging with these cards is being like, I don't really know that character. But I think he's pretty cool. Yeah, just learning about him now. And at the same time, seeing really nostalgic characters like Winnie the Pooh in the next set, that got me really happy.
How good is that art, though?
Yeah, no, it's awesome.
For a vanilla body, too. I think that's kind of, to me, one of the funniest things. This spectacular, very detailed art usually is paired with something kind of reflected in the description.
And I think that this, more than any other game, it just lends itself to liking the artwork as opposed to just being hyper competitive like I normally am. But I do enjoy when a card is incredibly powerful, and also the artwork is just cool. So
Oh, yeah. I've always
do
been
like
very
that.
art driven
Yes.
with games and stuff. That's actually any card games that I've played before. It was always the art that hooked me in
Okay.
before the actual play itself. In tandem, right? Because you see it and then you play it pretty immediately. If you
want to
get
win a
hooked,
little bit, but you want to win in style. Is what you're saying.
well, you want to win, but feel fancy while doing it. It does impact your
Well,
experience.
and
in game, at
Ruby
least in my
Amethyst,
opinion.
actually, one of the better villains in Maleficent is one of the best cards in that deck. So that could be a strategy that you would enjoy the most.
Yeah, we'll see. We'll see.
I don't know.
We'll find out as time goes on. It did sound like we are trying to get set for our next rounds now that we are at the halfway point
Yes.
of our Swiss rounds for the day. It's a lot of gameplay.
Yes, 8 rounds, very grueling, a lot of gameplay, a lot of decision making in each and every single one of those rounds. And this is where, again, fatigue starts sitting in these fourth and fifth round, and a lot of muscle memory is going to come into play, a lot of, practice and understanding your deck the most, and also what the opponents can do. And we actually get to see, I don't think it's Robert, but it is Roger on one side. That one changed, and then we'll see what the names end up locking in. But we do see a Steel Amber on one side, and we see Emerald. There is a Cheshire Cat played as
Let's
Ink face down, so
go.
we're gonna get to see a little bit of aggro action here. So it's actually Steel Emerald on one side versus Steel Amber, and super exciting to see. We actually get to see an Aladdin played on turn 2 versus the Prince Eric on the other side. So very exciting.
Oh, yes. We haven't seen this particular Aladdin today, I don't believe, as
Yeah.
far as on stream.
Yeah, so this Aladdin not very popular because of the fact that it only has 1 willpower, very susceptible to something like the shifting Tinkerbell. But that Aladdin does, because it has only 1 willpower, get 2 questing power as a result. Not looking too powerful in the face of this Prince Eric, but actually Hercules helping out a lot more. Hercules obviously with the bodyguard mechanic allowing it to quest for 2, and at the same time, being protected from Prince Eric on the way back. So, and then we get to see the Emerald Steel deck list. And does anything jump out to us from this deck list?
So we were talking so much about A Whole New World in the Amber context. We do see 3 copies in this particular Emerald Steel variant. The bodyguards, like you mentioned, Hercules coming through. But I also want to see the impact of the Cuscos and Hans. I feel like are very important in Emerald. Just those 3 lore points, seeing when you can get Hans at 4 cost being inkable, and then
Yes.
having that 3 lore threat with still a 3/3 body can be pretty significant.
Yeah, so he's definitely a significant body for the cost, and specifically, I want to see Roger play around the sort of smash effects and make sure that he definitely protects the Hans when he gets to play. So it's going to be very important when the Hans actually hits play, and also, I do want to see how well he can transition from this early game into the mid and late game, because being able to actually quest twice with this Aladdin is incredibly powerful. And then we do get to see that whole new world, giving him access to more cards later on. And Amber Steel deck list, it does seem to be that sort of slower, more mid-rangey list that we saw previously in round 3, actually, with no whole new worlds from this side.
I was trying to get a peek behind the curtain, and I do mean the literal curtain that is between us and the station on the stage.
I believe this
But I
Robert
think
is the
it's
same
the
player
same one.
so we're
I
doing
remember
a
the
little,
pink shirt.
we're doing a little Robert following campaign here
Yes.
on stream, and
The Robert build up.
we're gonna see if Robert can actually continue his undefeated streak here, or will the Emerald Steel deck actually. Ooh, and we do get to see a grab your swords dealing effectively with the Aladdin and then putting 2 damage on the Hans. Hans, again, having that 3 willpower, not actually falling to that, so it is going to quest at least once, presumably.
We'll see. And the Steel Hans we haven't seen in action much today, but we have talked about it a decent amount just because of that ability to ping down and whittle your opponents while garnering that lore for yourself through questing. Kind of when you're pairing that with some of the ping damage of Tinkerbell, then you can really add up over time, or multiple cases through which Roger should eventually try to deal with it, but got the big beefy Hans on the opposite side.
Yeah, and it's pretty powerful in this particular scenario, one Hans versus the other, because this Hans can actually quest for 2 and at the same time take the last point of willpower from the green Hans. So pretty timely that he has that available to him. But a whole new world is actually going to reset the game here. Critical note, unable to sing it because Hans is only a 4 cost, not a 5 cost. So Robert is actually going to get first crack at these brand new 7 cards, 8 when he draws for turn. But resetting the game, never too bad from the side of Roger.
Yeah, complete reset. That's always what it feels like when a whole new world comes in, because that's pretty much exactly as it is. You get 7 cards fresh into your hand and see what you can do with them. And I think that decks that are much more reliant on comboing, where you're focused so much on building the combos into your hand, usually feel a bit more of the frustration than those that are just trying to get bodies down.
Yes.
A lot of those with the earlier kind of low cost cards, it's like, you just gave me some other ones that I'm supposed to be throwing down.
Yeah, like a whole new world, a lot less efficient against opponents who are trying to curve out, play a 4th ink and then play a 4-drop, play a 5th ink and a 5-drop. Cards, decks that are doing that actually run out of cards pretty quickly, and a whole new world, just refuels them for free. That might actually be a consequence of why players that are playing Amber Steel are not playing something like a whole new world anymore, at least from the side of Robert. He's been really successful so far without it, is because just giving 7 cards to an opponent who's curving out on you is not ideal to what you want to be doing. And, understanding the format in that way is Robert, so that lends itself to why he is undefeated right now.
And I think the fact that we just witnessed Robert coming off of a matchup that went 2-1, where his opponent just had that heavy pivot point. It was the, Sapphire deck where, ran out of steam, one and done. And you could see by Robert's response, he just knew exactly where those windows are, clearly very tenured, knowing the ins and outs of his own deck as well as those conditions for his opponent. And it's nice when you can kind of get that warm up into it when you're coming off of these victories.
Yeah, and imagine in that scenario, Robert actually resetting the Sapphire player's hand in that game and giving them 7 new cards. It would have been a lot more difficult. In this case, actually punishing a little bit of what Roger was doing there, because these new 7 cards actually lend themselves to being able to deal with the board completely. So Roger has now no cards in play, and at the same time having complete board control with double aerial, being able to sing 2 5-cost songs and also adding a hook to the table as well. So just pure board control. But again, Roger does have 7 lore, so he is on his way. So we're going to get to see what his follow-up is in this case. Brand new hand as well here. So
See what he ends up throwing down to try and push that 7 lore that has been acquired all the more. 3 standing, though, for Robert in this opposition. 1 Inkwell advantage for Robert as well, or Roger, rather. 2 R names in this one.
Yes.
There we go. And we were talking about Mad Hatter because draw, always so important in any card games, right? It's one of the reasons that you see Amethyst combined with so many inks, but Mad Hatter being one that not only offers that high questing potential, but the ability to draw a card, and being a 4 willpower unit seems like it often gets a couple slams into Mad Hatter unless they decide to use some kind of removal in addition to challenges.
Yeah, so exactly that. Normally Mad Hatter drawing at least 1 card, if not 2, and at the same time having that 4 willpower threshold in order to force a hard removal as opposed to something like chip damage from the side of Amber Steel. So an incredibly powerful card in the matchup, and we do get to see Robert dealing with it with relative ease. I mean, he did have to expend some cards for it, but again, that very powerful 4-drop Steel Hans, being able to chip damage in combination with other cards to just get through it pretty quickly, and at the same time, everything sideways.
Yep. And this matchup, kind of as you're saying, what Robert's able to do to handle Roger, things like smashes just become so valuable. Yes, comboing any type of damage of 3 with Hans, as you mentioned, but also I'm thinking things like Cheshire Cat, where, okay, just throw down. Obviously, you then, when you're using this type of removal early on, then you're also thinking about the cards that you're not able to use it on later. But if the threats that are to come from Emerald are things like Cusco that you can't target with Smash anyways, then you might as well use it to expel some of these earlier threats and just banish the characters that are going to really start putting some threats onto the board over time.
And another consequence of letting Robert draw 7 cards is the fact that now he gets to see more copies of that Smash. So now something like Smash is more readily available to deal with something like this 3/3 Hans on the other side. And he does get to develop Hans, and hopefully it'll survive the turn cycle. But we're going to get to see how Robert gets to deal with it. And there you get to see another copy of Smash, just very effectively dealing with something that's normally really powerful against other color combinations. But when it comes to Steel, very easy to remove something that only has 3 willpower.
There are so many just characters in general that have only 3 willpower, which is just enough when facing off against some of, the 2 willpower characters. But then in this case, Smash just feels like you get the totality of the value available. So using that to clear, you can see just how much presence Robert has on the board right now, which is why he feels so willing and able to just go ahead and quest, bump up to 13 lore at this point, nearly double what Roger has.
Yeah, and Robert doesn't really care how Roger wants to try to handle most of his board, simply because, first of all, Roger doesn't have a board, aside from that Flame Rider, but at the same time, the removal is just not good removal against wide boards, right? Green, very effective at questing, but not at dealing direct damage. So this does seem like a little bit of an unsurmountable lead, and it feels like the game shifted when Rogers decided to draw 7 cards and effectively pass a turn, his turn 5, not being able to sing the Whole New World. It's very different when Whole New World actually gets sung with something like that, Ariel, because now you are the first one to benefit from your brand new hand. In this case, it wasn't the case, but we're going to get to see if Roger has any sort of comeback mechanics.
Ariel does just get a lot of value off of that being able to sing for 5. Oh my goodness, because it's just your own way of accelerating the pace of the game without having to worry too much about replenishing or utilizing your Inkwell to have such a swingy effect. And now Robert, with a lot of these low cost cards, one of the first things that can happen is running out of options in your hand and just throwing too much down. But says, okay, I've got everything here, I'm not worried about it, I'm still fully flush and still have many threats. I think Hans getting so much value too, because Flynn Rider on the opposite side, for instance, right? I love the text of Flynn Rider because of the specific of when challenged is when you actually get that opportunity to discard a card in the enemy's hand, which you think, okay, but he's not a very big body, so most things that challenge him wouldn't be that case, right? But sometimes early on, you do have those 1-strength units. Someone like Hans can just take 2 rounds to be able to ping him away and not worry about that and still maintain the hand advantage.
Yeah, and very consequential, not triggering that Flynn Rider effect to discard a card. And at the same time, Hans gets to quest while he does this as well. So Hans actually has, like you mentioned, gained an incredible amount of value over the course of the last few turns, and hasn't been very easy to deal with. And we do get to see a beast here, just solidifying the board, just saying, okay, I'm going to go ahead and quest with some of these cards, and then next turn is going to be unavoidable victory from the side of Robert. So Roger is going to get one last draw step here. And then I don't think there's any miracle draws that can then they're available here, but we're going to get to see how Roger wants to approach the matchup in the next game. We're just going through the motions here real quick, but just so much questing power from the side of Robert.
Yeah, the build-up over the course of 3 or 4 rounds just ended up being huge. And even when comparing the Hans that Robert has versus the Hans that Roger has, yes, the Emerald Hans has that additional questing power with 3, but okay, if there's nothing else that you're threatening and you don't have other units to try and draw some of that attention from Robert, then are you really going to get that double up of value? Whereas the Steel Hans, questing multiple times, getting removal by double pinging one of the units on Roger's side and Flynn Rider, and suddenly this board just feels like you cannot overcome what Robert has thrown down at 18 lore and right here within lethal.
Yeah, so Roger is actually going to shortly, go into game 2, but he does actually do something that I like, which is he's going to get a little bit more information about Robert's deck. So he basically uses a whole new world to reset both players' hand, and he gets to see a few more cards that were discarded from Robert's hand. So just getting a little bit more information before actually conceding the game. So you do get to like that little nuance, because again, just information is power in this case. And so Roger, right before conceding, he knew he was going to lose that game, but he gets a little bit of information going out the door. So
that can go a long way, and that's where you're about to face off against the same exact deck.
Exactly.
And that can very much inform your decisions and how you decide to carry out the game.
Yeah, so we're going to get to see how Roger wants to approach the matchup in game 2, because again, he did open up a pretty decent opening. He went Aladdin onto, which is exactly what he wants to be doing. He protected it with a Hercules on turn 3, got to quest twice with it. So his early game was more or less what you want to see. Maybe not in the matchup, but like overall, it was a decent opener. So how does he actually pivot from that? Maybe he prioritizes more the mid to late game. Maybe he tries to deal with that Steel Hans that you were mentioning before. Just got so much value over the course of the game. Try to find a way to remove that from the table, maybe.
Yeah, I think that sometimes with characters like Hans, or a lot of these characters that have value, but it feels like it needs to stack over a few turns before you really feel the impact. That can be a tough position, because you think, okay, do I expel some of my heaviest resources now to make sure they can't do anything, or leave an opening and you think, okay, I thought that this wasn't the direction they were going to go. I didn't know that they were going to widen the board so much. I thought that I was only going to have 2 units that I had to worry about, and when you get as flooded as Robert was able to make it, choosing to take away Hans, who, yes, is pinging down your team, versus some of the other bigger bodies that have more questing power, your decisions become more difficult, and it feels like there's a disadvantage to every choice that you make. And I think that Robert put a lot of pressure to have Roger really feeling that.
And having those really powerful three-will cards, like the Hans, and particularly the Ariel as well. What do you get rid of? Do you get rid of the Ariel that can sing Gravity Source to deal with your board? Or do you get rid of Hans, who's pinging down your board? So there's just so many different cards that you have to prioritize one over the other, and you have to kind of guess what your opponent's resources are in hand in order to do that. So gonna see what Roger prioritizes in game 2. But for right now, Robert just inks down, and no 1-drop of consequence here. If Roger has something like a 1-drop from his side, he could start rolling a little bit. So it could actually be a 2-drop, maybe something like Flynn Rider. And no, he actually just whiffs on that and passes turn. So we'll get to see what his turn 3 on the other side. The Prince. So this Prince Eric actually holding down the board, and I've seen him a lot over the course of the tournament as a 2-drop play that can go up to that 3 attack power, and that threshold is quite good for a 2-drop.
Yeah, a lot of times when anyone plays Prince Eric, you kind of just keep him there ready to swing when he needs to. It's only one lore. You're not missing out on a lot if you don't actually activate him in any sort of way. You just want that chance to challenge someone once they become vulnerable and force Roger into a position where he has to choose. Do I even quest here if this silly little 2-cost person to Eric is going to be able to take out my unit? I can feel bad if you're throwing down a 4-cost or something of the like, right? And with that additional challenging potential of Prince Eric can stand up to some of them. So starting off, and it's nice when you can get him down against a board that's not threatening yet, because 1-3 on without challenging can not be that threatening in itself, but more, hey, I have something in the tank if you throw down a character.
And it gives you that option of when does this actually go sideways? Do I quest with, do I attack with something, or just leave it behind like you mentioned before? And right now, both players actually leaving behind their board, because I think these Tinkerbells, you know, very suspicious in turning into the bigger Tinkerbell and breaking whole boards. So both players want to be aware that the big tank is available on both sides, and they probably just want to take it a little bit slower. And what's really good at taking the game slow, this aerial that's actually going to get a song from the top of the deck, so incredibly powerful. And just building up is the Steel Amber deck. So
Both Robert and Roger do have access to 4 big tanks if they want to make the play down the line, but a bit of a character advantage in terms of current presence for Robert. Nobody luring just yet. It's all been about developing the board and the inkwells thus far.
And if the matchup turns into this sort of go wide, you know, situation on both sides, because neither player wants to play into something like a Tinkerbell getting maximum value, then Robert's side actually having access to grab your swords easier with this aerial makes board breaking a little easier. If you go something like big tank into singing grab your swords, it can actually, you know, destroy most of the side of Roger's board. So it's going to be who gets to make that play first, I think, that's going to break the board. And actually a smash on this aerial.
Yes.
Stopping that development from that side.
Well, because you can have the same card in 2 different decks, and it just feels more powerful in one compared to the other, right? Here, oh, I can get a grab your sword and play it before I even hit 5 because I have aerial. Great. Whereas Roger has to focus on getting that inkwell to a point where he can even play it to begin with. So clearly trying to just completely wipe out the possibility of Robert getting grab your sword early on here at what was 3 ink, and then now building up towards 5 to still have that as an option if he wishes to later on. But good forward thinking of Roger.
Yeah, and very good to use that smash. Even if grab your swords was the play for Robert on this turn, at least it wasn't a free play.
Right.
It could have been much worse from the side of Roger. He could have dealt with grab your swords and an additional 5 cost on top of that. So just good understanding of the matchup there. But he did get grab your swords, and now his board is a little weaker, but he does have this Mickey here, and this Mickey actually has 7 willpower.
7. That is a very big number.
Big Mickeys.
Yeah, and I think that with Steel, there are some really big character bodies that we, at first, I feel like we didn't see at all because it was just a lot of faster variants of Steel Amber decks and the like. But now as
the Stitch variants, for example.
Yeah, exactly. But recently kind of seeing more because there's like different Simbas in there, just kind of this whole other chunk of Steel that is getting accessed a little more in recent times, at least from what I've witnessed in games.
Yeah, and that's a consequence of cards with higher willpower being prioritized because of something like we mentioned, Grab Your Swords and Tinkerbell. If the Steel decks are opting for the sort of removal package that does chip damage, I'm just going to play beefy boards, and not very easy to deal with those.
And it is kind of one of the defining characteristics of Steel is how they just have these bodyguards and very supportive field, even not talking about the support keyword necessarily, though present within Lorcana, but that kind of support to your other units where you're trying to draw the attention from the biggest threats of your opposition. But speaking of threats, Robert did get towards that shifting the big tink here. So a good combo play to take control right now.
Yeah, so a full board break from the side of Robert toward Roger, and it's a consequence of that big Tinkerbell being able to get maximum value by attacking into one of the characters and then dealing 2 damage to the other one, and at the same time, Grab Your Swords proving instrumental. Chip damage does eventually get there, as it turns out here, so just no board from the side of Roger, and how does he recover from this one? And it's just seeming like the access that Amber gives you into these powerful songs is looking like the mirror breaker in this case. You know, both players access to Steel, but Amber just looking like a little bit better in that color combination.
Yeah, because when both Robert and Roger had somewhat similar strategies in that they were trying to fill the board, yeah, 4 lore points for Roger, but nothing really to worry about just yet. Getting it wiped feels that much more impactful
Yeah.
because you weren't trying to build up lore. Oh, I don't have a board, but I'm 10 ahead. Or,
Yeah,
oh,
exactly.
I've got these other spells that I'm trying to replenish my hand after anyway. It can completely change your pacing. Now with a Tinkerbell of Roger's own, answering Tink for Tink, 3 damage currently for Robert's side.
Do we get to see a Rapunzel here, actually? Rapunzel being able to fully heal Tink and at the same time
Again, an
drawing 3
Amber.
cards. Yes,
Yep.
another Amber staple in Rapunzel as well. So, oh, and this one as well. You Have Forgotten Me, just very crippling for Robert in this case because Roger was actually running out of cards and now he's fully out of them and it's looking a little dicey. But he does have some top decks he can rely on, being Cheshire Cat in this case. Okay, so one step closer.
And that is where you do run into some difficulty, though, if you're Roger and you're looking for draw or some kind of way to replenish your hand. Yes, you're running a whole new world, but beyond that, any of the draw presence feels very conditional. You know, a Mad Hatter that we had already seen in the previous game, but you're relying upon your getting challenged and your character kind of putting in that work in that regard. But still, because he's indexed into some of these bigger bodies like Mickey Mouse, like Cerberus, as you're saying, top decking potential, not as detrimental in this deck compared to some others.
Yeah, definitely haymakers from the top of the deck, but doesn't have that refueling capability that Robert does. So we're going to have to see if something like a Whole New World comes through. Even if it does, is giving Robert a 7-card hand actually that good in this? Because, I mean, you tap down your Tinkerbell and Cerberus is already at the ready to try to challenge it out of the board. So overall, just at a deficit from the side of Roger. The only thing that Roger does have going for him is the fact that Robert just got his first point of lore. So it's going to be a little bit of a grindy situation from this point in time. And we're going to see, a very nice combo here.
Yes, indeed. So Hades has become even more prevalent in Amber as well. Just that ability to bring something back from the discard and really index all the heavier into your win conditions. Ariel, great win condition.
Yes. And we get to see buying back the Ariel, actually getting it from the discard pile, not necessarily relying on the fact that you have to draw your other copies of it. If one gets dealt with, you can use that exact same one. So it's almost Hades acting as a 5th through 8th copy of other cards in your deck as well, and just giving it that maximum versatility while at the same time getting a lot of good card advantage is Robert. So we do get to see little Tink from the side of Roger. Good, but maybe he wants to see a little bit larger being something like Cusco. We haven't seen Cusco in the entire matchup right now, and he desperately needs one of those, as Cusco, one of the best options at not getting targeted by something like that Tinkerbell effect, as well as other cards. So just in general, the deck not being too kind to him right now, but we will see if he tries to draw out of this. He is at 6 lore, and with the 5 lore in play, that's 11. Almost more than halfway there, but is it going to be enough? Is my question.
Now, Robert, for a second, looked like was feeling safe enough to start questing, with that single lore, but just as quickly as Roger bouncing back, we will have to see if it ends up being enough. Maybe another tank to shift on here if needed later, but I think one thing to consider there is just the units are getting larger on Robert's side, so the single ping of damage across doesn't have as much of an impact when you're having. You still have Hades and things like that that can just follow up with one more ping afterwards, but nonetheless, grab your sword, coming in hot.
And again, this Grab Your Sword's not the maximum value because it doesn't actually deal with any card on the other side, but now sets up for something like a big Tinkerbell for the side of Robert, being able to deal with that Cheshire Cat and chipping even more toward the other 2 cards. But overall, just a value Grab Your Sword at this point. And does this actually incentivize Roger to try to quest with some of these cards? Maybe he's afraid that they're going to get dealt with over the course of the next few turns.
It's one of the differences between Amber Seal and this Emerald Seal, where Amber, you have something like Rapunzel that you always have to be worried about that heal. If you're playing against a Rapunzel, your Tinkerbells potentially don't have as much of an impact. So I think Robert feels more confident in doing so because that's not the case for Roger. But the trade-off for not having Rapunzel is having these units that can quest more effectively, be more powerful in accruing that lore. So if he's stopped in his tracks and can't actually take that step forward in terms of questing, that's where things start to get dicey for Roger in this matchup. And despite having a board advantage for a little bit of time, is starting to see it even out once more as the smash comes through to take Hans out before he can make that questing happen.
Yeah, so we saw that in game one. One of the best trades that the steel color in general can have against that Hans is just, you know, one card smash and your 4-drop is gone. But at the same time, we did not get to see that pivotal Rapunzel from the side of Robert, so he is actually running out of cards, and still the only player with Tinkerbell on the table is Roger. So if Roger over the course of the next few turns can find some sort of these haymakers, and speaking of haymakers, a top decked aerial from, and we're gonna get to see, hopefully it doesn't whiff. If it grabs something like a BR guest, that can kind of chain resources into each other. So, and this server is very confidently just going sideways with that 6 willpower. It's been quite instrumental. It's already gotten, I believe, 4 lore over the course of this game. So, good doggo.
Yeah, the doggo gets to have freedom because of smashing the bad things away.
Exactly. And even though Roger has had access to his Tinkerbell over the course of the last few turns, he hasn't been able to quest with it because he wants to save it for this exact situation. He gets to deal with Cerberus and the aerial as well, so deciding to cash it in now, and both fields actually empty, and this is going to actually turn into a top deck war. And not as timely as he wanted it to be. Robert would have loved that 1 or 2 turns ago, but still knows that this is going to turn into a lore race, and he is actually a little bit behind in that race, so he just plays it on the table. Okay, and this is actually fantastic. So he's going to have a Jasper into Cheshire Cat, and what this allows him to do is to Jasper the Rapunzel. The Rapunzel is not going to be able to quest in the following turn, and then the Cheshire Cat is going to, you know, force the prince to attack it. So
that's huge. It denies pretty much all the things that make Rapunzel Rapunzel. Didn't get to heal anything, so then didn't get to draw anything. Okay, well, at least she has 2 lore points, so maybe she can get some questing done. And then Roger says, I got Jasper here, so I don't know what you think you're going to do with Rapunzel. She is stuck in that tower. I am not letting her let her hair down. She is keeping that in a tight bun for the rest of the time.
And I do like the references to the movies. They're quite good, but still, Robert does have a few more draw steps in order to draw something really good. And BR Guess is exactly what he was looking for. Now he can actually try to find in the top 4 cards some sort of pivotal card. Something like a big Tinkerbell here would be instrumental in making inroads on this board. And does he actually find it in this turn? He is facing down something like this Cusco that was actually one of the best top decks for Roger. So this is one of the more important finds. Can Roger actually make, and he does find the larger Tinkerbell, so that is fantastic, and just enough ink to be able to play it.
Oh my word, I got so tense there. We've been waiting for Cusco to pop up, and anytime that the hands are feeling a bit famished, there's that much more pressure on what you end up drawing into. Cusco can be so effective, but yeah, Robert still being able to draw into some significant strength with that Tinkerbell. So just as soon as you get, you know, one of your winning plays, there's an answer waiting on at least getting some of the tick damage, though you wouldn't be able to actually target the Cusco with the secondary portion of the effect when banishing, but a big body to slam in.
And a Rapunzel was actually the other card in the hand. So not only is access to the Tinkerbell in hand, but also Rapunzel gets to heal 2 and draw 2 cards. So in this top deck war, actually Robert gets a little bit ahead. And again, we talked about the consequence of having those powerful amber draw effects in a situation like this. Even though Roger found Cusco, that was, I feel, the last turn that Robert could actually try to find a pivotal card, and he actually found multiple in that case. So very good on Robert's side. And what can Roger actually do? If he chains together a few more Cuscos, he could actually end this game over the course of the next few turns. Cusco obviously having that 3 questing power and the ability to no touchy, not allowed to be touched by any of the other effects. But is it actually going to be enough? This race is actually incredibly close from both sides. Roger doesn't have the ability to deal with any of the cards in play, so he's just going to say, okay, I'm questing instead.
Yeah, I mean, as we said before, this is the first Cusco of this game. First Cusco of this match, actually. So that means there's still 3 in the wings waiting to be drawn. And double Cusco can end a game. And you just leave them there until you're really close to just the 6 closer that you need. And right now at 16 lore for Roger.
Any 2 cards in the game. And pivotal. He actually top decked a Mad Hatter. So Mad Hatter, a little bit less powerful than Cusco, but only in some matchups. In this matchup in particular, actually, the chip damage is not going to be enough to deal with the 4 willpower. So it is effectively just a 3 questing card that has to be dealt with. And how does Robert actually go about doing this? Step 1, playing Big Tink. It feels like that's the first part to every board break is the Big Tinkerbell.
It would slow Robert down so much if he just slammed multiple characters into Cusco, because he's also trying to win the race now that it's 16 on Roger's side, and having to sacrifice some characters here. It's just the Mad Hatter standing on the side of Roger. That Cusco was a big threat that needed to be dealt with. So Roger no longer in game-ending territory,
Yes.
one off of it, but still very close.
Yeah, and this card has to be fundamentally anything with questing power, but a larger character card, the 3 willpower and more, just to not be dealt with by something like a smash or any sort of chip damage effect from the side of Robert. If Roger can actually top deck any character card with decent amount of willpower, it might be just enough to get him to that magical 20 number. He is going to go to 19 at the end of this turn. And what actually did he top deck? A big Tinkerbell!
Woo! Big Tinkerbell!
So, oh my god, this race is incredibly exciting. So now Robert actually has to find a way to deal with both of these characters if presumably Roger quests. And now this is actually an interesting inflection point. So does Roger just wait a turn and force Robert to have something like a smash, or does he quest with the Mad Hatter this turn, go to 19? That would allow Robert to actually attack with Tinkerbell and more easily deal with the Tinkerbell on the other side. It's just an interesting inflection point, and he doesn't actually decide to quest. So, and now he needs a top deck, does Robert. And not enough. So there we go. So Roger making a huge comeback over the course of the last few turns, understanding that there was no way for him to actually control the board, so he just said, okay, outrace me, and he got there.
Wow, I really enjoyed that last game. It was such a nail-biter, because once Rapunzel came into play for Robert, past the one that didn't get any real value, then it felt like, okay, hand's going to get replenished again. He's going to be able to keep things just off to the side and, start clearing the board and be able to continue to catch up. But those units coming in, I think the Cusco drawing a lot of the attention and saying, you have to deal with me or I win. Mad Hatter as well, just a good questing potential. And then the Big Tink coming. Big Tink was putting in work for both
for
of these
both players
throughout
that
this.
Card
So
is crazy.
it's very much within the storyline of that matchup to see your Tink, my Tink, your Tink, and my Tink.
Yeah, and we got to see there a highlight of why Emerald is so powerful in the matchup. Amber having that card advantage during the end portion of that game. And we thought that actually Robert was going to get through the finish line and go 2-0. But what ended up happening was he didn't have enough time to actually develop all those threats. And just the back-to-back top decks of the 3 questing power Cusco into the Mad Hatter were just enough to eke out the victory. And there was just not enough chip damage to deal with those cards because, again, they have, with the Tinkerbell 5 willpower, the Mad Hatter 4 willpower, the Cusco 4 willpower. It's just so difficult to get through a lot of these threats.
We will see who comes out on top in the third game of this matchup. Who gets rid of the threats? Who makes threats of their own and gets away with the dub? 1-1 between Robert and Roger at our PPG Lorcana OP Tour Miami.
And again, Robert is going to be on the play for game 3. Incredibly pivotal against decks that are trying to curve out, like we mentioned before. Just being ahead in play and having something like that Prince Eric already in play for when the opponents try to play the 3 willpower cards, like the Cheshire Cat, for example. Just all the more good for Robert in that situation. But can Roger actually, make something out of this early game? Because, again, we've seen Grab Your Swords be a lot more effective from the side of Robert. So maybe those pushback mechanics not as good from the Emerald Steel side.
And when you have the early Prince Erics and cards like that, the Grab Your Sword when paired with the Aerial, it becomes so much more effective because of the number of units that fall within that 2 willpower range. But we will see what happens here. I know you're mentioning that it's great for this particular deck to have the first turn, but do you think there any other decks that you see even more of a need to do that as well? Because there's typically statistically an advantage to going first, but you gotta imagine definitely some decks more than others.
So I would say some decks definitely benefit from the extra card when they decide to go second, but for the most part, you do want to have that initiative because it allows you to curve out more effectively. If your deck is trying to go that 2, 3, 4 into 5, like just bomb, bomb, bomb every single turn, and you have not that much synergy, but just a lot of card quality, then you want to decide to go first. And especially Robert wants to go first because he gains access to that aerial very early on, and that just compounds the value that he can get from his songs. So overall, do want to go first most of the time.
First is good. If you ain't first, you're last. Someone said once upon a time. I do have a question for the chat because I see Alex Kent said, someone beat Robert, LOL. How many of y'all want to see Robert just go the distance and keep getting the doves, the victor of the last round we had on stream? Do you want to see the 2-0 overall in terms of matches from Robert and what we're witnessing? Or are you making him the villain in your mind, saying, bring him down, we don't need kings here?
So who can take down Robert is the story developing right now, but he's looking decently well. He is facing down a 3-drop Tinkerbell again. We've seen that this Tinkerbell controls the board so well, and he actually responds with one of his own, so not falling behind in any way is Robert. And most of his games have gone down to this pivotal game 3. Can he clutch this one out like he did the previous one? And just a consequence of the deck choice, right? Steel Amber, just an incredibly powerful deck, and we've seen that Robert understands these matchups quite well.
Yeah, and chat definitely giving props for understanding these matchups too, just like you just were saying, knows how to play this deck. I see some declaration of red purple as the villain. And interesting question from In This Score, I believe. So is this an undefeated Emerald? I mean, rhetorical question, as clearly remarking on the fact that Roger is 4-0. But I want to ask that to you directly is, I know that you're an Emerald fan, but is it a surprise to you at all that Robert is currently undefeated in terms of series score coming into this?
So definitely Roger, right? The Emerald, Steel Emerald?
Yes.
So definitely I do want to say that Roger, obviously a master of his deck. He's proven it here. He's doing really well navigating through the sort of removal that Robert is implementing. Overall, I do believe that he is going to face some difficulties over the course of the tournament because of, for example, using a whole new world and that card not being the most wonderful in what we've seen the decks overall over the course of the weekend. Obviously, that card incredibly powerful when it resolves, but it can be a little detrimental in some scenarios, and a lot of people seem to be building their decks to not necessarily counter but not be too terribly affected by it. So we're going to have to see how well Roger can navigate, can he actually use that card to his advantage in most scenarios, or will it actually prove to be detrimental for his deck moving forward? But again, that just might be a consequence of the fact that Emerald doesn't have that much card draw. So he might just say, okay, refueling myself is more important than them getting 7 cards, and that's just what it is. But overall, I do think Roger has a color combination that can win an event like this one, and so far, he's proving it. So.
Off of cards like Kuska that we're finally starting to see a bit more of in this match. It took so long in the last game.
Curving out perfectly into that Cusco, but Robert not falling behind, being able to be on the play like I mentioned before, is the first one with a big tink in play. And notably, one of the main things that the players are doing differently from previous rounds is they're actually not shifting onto the small Tinkerbell as much. I think that the small Tinkerbell is just a threat saying, okay, neither of us are questing anymore. And then now that they're on that 6 ink territory, you can say, oh, I'm just going to play this, keep my 3-drop, and also have the 6-drop and play at the same time.
Yeah, I think when it comes to shifting, that's one thing that I'd like to track over time, just the development of the strategy, because when it first came, okay, well, I really want to prioritize using shift in a way that I can have my curve earlier, I can get these units out, but sometimes just having multiple bodies on the board is so useful, and if you're already at an inkwell of 6 and there's not really some other play that's more advantageous for that shifting, then why not have that additional threat? The willpower on Lil Steel Tink isn't that bad to really be able to have some stickiness.
Especially when paired with something like Rapunzel. If it does go up to the 3 damage, and then we're going to get to see actually some attempt at breaking the board here. We're going to see where that attack actually goes into. Tinkerbell ready to attack the Cerberus. So it's actually going to be a full trade from both sides, but it does get to take down the Tinkerbell on the other side. So Roger's saying, okay, I have a decent grasp over the board. I'm just going to make some consolidations here. And then at the end, Cusco stands tall.
Yeah. Cusco has a lot of attitude, and very fitting, very reflective of the character in the movie. But Roger feeling good about the fact that Cusco is still alive on the board, did get a decent amount of value, has the Hans as well, so the presence of lore available for Roger is pretty threatening in this instance that Robert doesn't want to let get completely out of hand.
And here, this BR guess might be a consequence of the fact that Robert is actually looking for another big Tink, because it would be beneficial to get rid of both Cusco and the Hans on the other side. And he does actually have exactly 4 ink left in order to be able to do that play. And he's saying, okay, I know that my Tink is going to be gotten rid of on the other side, but he does have to get rid of this 6 questing power from the other side. And he actually can't. He only has the Hades here, so he has to wait an entire turn cycle after presumably picking up this Tinkerbell from the discard pile. We'll see what he actually ends up deciding to get, but there's going to be 6 lore made for Roger on the following turn.
6 lore, that is a lot, already over 25% of the way there once Roger decides to quest. But yes, Robert did end up grabbing that Tinkerbell, so Hades putting in the work to replenish the utility that she offers, especially when the units are on the brink of banishment.
And very important that this green Hans actually has 1 damage on it, the Tinkerbell being able to get rid of it. So at any point in time that this Cusco goes sideways, we can see that trade happen. But something tells me that Roger does not mind gaining 6 lore here. And he actually has the counter with the Mickey as well. Now if there's a shifting Tinkerbell on the other side, Mickey will not actually fall to it unless this Hades is also invested. So a lot of check marks from the side of Roger in order to take a lot of control over this board. And we're going to get to see how Robert tries to deal with this. And I think Grab Your Swords would be one of the pivotal cards for Robert to have in this scenario if he actually gets to draw it.
Yeah, would be pretty phenomenal considering the damage already dealt to multiple characters on Roger's side. And I'm glad we get to see that Mickey Mouse again, you know, one of the units that's just a lot beefier. We talked about the impact of Bodyguard and what that can do from a steel perspective. I've also seen, have you seen like the fun Musketeer decks? Have you run into any?
There are a lot of Musketeer synergies. So we were talking about archetypes in our reveal. And one of the archetypes that exist in set 1 are in fact Musketeers, and they might not have the most powerful synergies, but they're definitely super fun with you know, those outfits that they have on.
Yeah.
So just a fun show overall, and this card's actually incredibly powerful, and we can see its power here, completely stopping the Tinkerbell shift play. And actually this Hans and Cusco are going to survive an entire turn cycle because of it, and I think that this might be the point in the game that is a little insurmountable. And if everybody in the chat that wanted Robert to not make it undefeated, I believe that things are getting a little difficult for our presumed hero here. So we'll see how things develop. But Emerald might actually take down a match here on stream. So that's also very exciting.
Yeah, and just to think that, you know, whenever we have the privilege of on stream watching these matches where both players are 4-0, it just raises the stakes all that more. Not only are we seeing an Emerald potentially come out with a victory here, but Robert also potentially getting his first loss of this tournament thus far. But when you're 5 rounds deep, it's not a bad time to get your first loss. If you do, that's pretty great.
Yeah, definitely a 4-1 scoreline in a situation like this. Not terrible. Obviously, ideal would be 5-0, but at 4-1, he would just have to recompose himself and continue rattling on wins. He is obviously very capable of doing that. And the game is not over yet. There are definitely some scenarios where he can break through this field from Roger, but Roger is going to go up so much in lore this turn, and at any point in time, Roger can just say, I'm going to turn this into a racing situation and go sideways with everything.
Which feels like it's always an option with Emerald, just kind of turning it into a race as soon as either you won too early on in the game or if things get a bit out of your control. And Mad Hatter continuing to index into that racing potential. And everybody else questing.
Yes. And now actually any sort of board wiping effect from the side of Robert is greatly mitigated because now every single threat is almost game from the side of Roger. And not only that, Robert actually still has to get through this Mickey. Such a large body at 6 willpower remaining even after that 1 damage. And we're going to see a trade into the Mickey here, going to assign 2 damage to it, bring it to 4 willpower left, and then Tink finishing it off.
Trying to take 2 of the characters out right now, both the Mickey and the Hans banished by that Tinkerbell play. Good on Robert to be able to do that because Mickey Mouse threatens Steel and just Amber with the fact that aside from smashes and a combo with Tink damage, it can be so hard to whittle into that HP. So trying to take care of it as quickly as you can, get that bodyguard out of there so you can start dealing with the other characters like Mad Hatter, now the sole character positioned for Roger.
And we saw even if Roger made his board susceptible to being attacked into, it actually traded effectively with most of the board from the side of Robert. So Roger getting both the value from the questing and also trading 1-for-1 with most of his threats. So a very good timing for questing in that last turn, and now being at 14 versus 4. Robert has to make sure that he gets every single value trade possible from this point forward. But again, just so much willpower from the side of the Emerald player.
Yeah, because, you know, these see, there's a smash. We've seen so many Emerald.
Smash on Hans, yeah.
Yeah, Hans is smashed.
Very timely.
His scheming not strong enough to keep the smash at bay here, but alas, Robert feeling good about that.
When does he cash in this Mad Hatter? And does he even need to? The consequence of the fact that Mad Hatter having 4 willpower, it won't get destroyed by any one card. Oh, this actually indicates to me that he might just pass turn with the Flynn Rider. He doesn't want Flynn Rider to be destroyed by something like the Tinkerbell on the other side.
Yeah, that would be an easy, nice
yes.
across the way clear.
And then after that, what is the follow-up? He still does have 4 ink remaining. And does he even want to commit any more to the board? Something like Grab Your Swords could be very good if he does. Oh, and he actually decides to quest here. So this might be Roger actually making an interesting play, saying, okay, you have to deal with this Mad Hatter, and it's going to give me an extra card. Oh, and he actually bounces back the Tinkerbell. So that's an incredible play from the side of Roger. And it allows him to quest with the Mad Hatter while also having Robert not deal with the Flynn Rider very cleanly. So an incredibly good play from the side of Roger.
Yeah, because Flynn Rider was just looking too vulnerable at this point otherwise, right? A lot of times these 2-cost characters, you're just inking at this point. But hey, if you can make sure that there's no direct threat that's going to be a problem, then suddenly you have this 2-lore unit. You're at 17 lore as is.
Yeah.
Still a little bit out of the winning vicinity, but nonetheless, Robert using a Grab Your Sword just to be able to get Flynn Rider out of there.
Exactly. So Flynn Rider getting maximum value off of a 2-drop at this point in the game, almost forcing an entire turn cycle to be used on just getting rid of him. But it is understandable from the side of Robert because, again, Roger being at 17, almost any threat at this point from the Emerald Steel player will end the game. And this, another timely threat with the Genie, actually.
It's our first Genie, huh?
It is.
There are only 2 in this deck.
Okay, so definitely Genie, just a curved topper. He just uses it to eke out the rest of the points that he needs to win with that very powerful evasive keyword, and at the same time resetting Robert's board with the disappear effect. So these 2 bounce effects over the course of the last few turns were actually backbreaking for Robert from the side of Roger. So I do like to see, you know, the green implementation of those bounce effects. It was incredibly powerful here.
It shows that I feel like inks like Emerald that you do still see often, but I mean, today we haven't seen as often, right? And in comparison to some of the others, it's easy to forget that there is a decent amount of versatility in what you can do. And having Genie, who we hadn't seen this match at all yet, just 2 copies in it, and these bounce backs that were not a component prior, now having a heavy impact when playing Robert, willing to take that damage again from something like Tinkerbell just to be able to slow the pace and get closer towards that 20 lore.
And of note, the evasive keyword on the Genie is going to make it immune to the Tinkerbell on the other side. So anything played from the side of Roger is going to be safe from that Tinkerbell effect. And I do believe this Mad Hatter, unless Robert finds a way to cobble together a lot of indirect damage.
Like, how many smashes has Robert played? What?
Let's look at the graveyards a little bit.
Yes.
Already 2 in there, so I don't think that that's going to be relatively available. And we do get to see, just for show, a Maui 3 questing power and a concession there at the end.
All right.
Wow.
Can we get
Incredible
some
match.
claps in
Yes, that was a very exciting match here in round 5. Our best match so far, I want to say. Very back and forth on both sides. Indicative of how grindy the steel color is in general, and then the splashes of green and amber we got to see in full effect there. So,
And I think Robert and Roger both played very well.
Yes.
And which we know won from their score line being very consistent, but we did get to see Robert back to back, and I think that he showed adaptation in each matchup. Roger coming in clearly knew what his win conditions were. I saw the chat debating at some point whether he should have quested earlier at some points to kind of put him in that threatening territory or not. I think that's where you get into that nitty gritty, right? Of you can go either way and see what ends up working out, and in this case.
When exactly do I choose to quest my characters in order to get the maximum value and also force my opponent into awkward lines of play? We saw there, for example, toward the end of the game where he played a Flynn Rider at like turn 20-something of the game, but it got maximum value. It even forced out a Grab Your Swords because of the tempo that Roger had accrued over the course of the game. So just knowing when to use your resources at pivotal points, and Roger just showing that he understood the matchup very well there. And also, Cusco, a highlight. We saw that it was a pretty relatively simple win from the side of Robert in Game 1, but then the Cuscos were actually fundamental in Game 2 and 3 and kind of pushing that Emerald strategy forward. So we got to see that in full effect there, which is cool.
Yeah, because it's difficult to remember some of the specifics of Game 1, but it didn't look like he even drew into Cusco.
Yeah, exactly.
Really.
No, he did not draw into Cusco, and it looked relatively simple from the side of Robert. And again, going back to what chat said about when to quest specifically, so the main reason why both players didn't quest a lot in the early game is, again, that presence of the 3-drop Tinkerbell. 3-drop Tinkerbell can turn into the shifted Tinkerbell 6-drop at any point in time and just break a whole board. So you have to be, understanding of when the Tinkerbells can come down, forcing a bit of resources, forcing out the Grab Your Swords in awkward situations so that, one player doesn't have them later on in the game, and then going wide on the board. And it's all a consequence of matchup knowledge, right? So... And we get to see there, it wasn't exactly wide boards, even though Steel does that relatively well. It was actually tall characters, like the 7 willpower Mickey Mouse came through really important in that matchup, making Cusco actually quested, I think, for like 9 that game, which was really crazy. So
yeah, I mean, that's what kind of looking at this Steel Emerald deck that Roger had brought through, I was curious how kind of those bigger units would come to play. And I think that Mickey Mouse, you're right to be pointing that out, and just the value that he was able to draw, because if they're both getting to that point of kind of in that race, and it's just such a stopping point, you just make your opponent hit the emergency brake a little bit as they're trying to move through.
And it's already difficult for something like Steel to get through these big willpower cards, but when you have multiple of them in play at the same time and one of them has something like a keyword bodyguard, it can also make it awkward in terms of trades. We saw ineffective trades from the side of Robert, just trying to whittle down the Mickey Mouse first, losing a little bit of value there, and then eventually getting through it. But by the time he got through it, the damage was already done. So.
Well, good on Roger.
Very good round overall.
For bringing us play. All righty, everyone. Seems like we are going to a bit of a break, and when we return, we'll have more of our tournament for you. It's been fun so far.
Round 6 coming up soon.
Yeah, round 6.